Hello, everyone. Welcome to the main stage for our afternoon keynote session. I'm your moderator, Kim Slade. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Tamara Cherry. Tamara is a trauma researcher, author, and victim survivor advocate who spent the bulk of her career as an award-winning crime reporter in some of Canada's largest newsrooms. She is now working on her second book, a part-time journalism, part memoir examination of her research into the impact of media on trauma survivors and the impact of trauma on journalists. I encourage you to read her full bio in the speaker section of the conference. Welcome, Tamara, and thank you for being with us today. We're looking so forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Kim, for that nice introduction. As Kim said, my name is Tamara Cherry, and I'm delivering this presentation from Regina, Saskatchewan, which is located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Before we get started, I want to let you all know that the clips that you will see of trauma survivors are being shared with their informed consent. And there will be some time at the end for questions. I also want to thank Abuse Hurts for organizing this conference. I do not consider myself an expert in the experiences of trauma survivors, or anybody's experiences for that matter, or an expert in the area of trauma-informed journalism. I'm just here to talk about what I know, and I'm here to learn, because one of the biggest takeaways from this journey that I've been on over the last couple years is that there is always more to learn. So about a couple decades ago, after finishing a year of pre-pharmacy at the University of Regina, I moved to Vancouver for a summer of soul searching. And during a phone call with my dad, he said, well, you like to write and you like to talk to people. Why don't you go into journalism? Yes, excellent idea. I can write for a snowboarding magazine, I thought. Little did I know what my future had in store. My first reporting gig came as an intern at the Regina Leader-Post. My first week on the job, I interviewed a journalist and author from New York whose father had died from Alzheimer's disease. I was taken aback when she started crying during the interview. In the end, she cried, I cried, and this was the story that sparked my love for telling stories that make people feel something, that make people care. My next internship was at the Calgary Herald. I wrote about all sorts of things while there, but the one story that sticks out for me is the story of a professional skier who died suddenly. I was tasked with phoning his widow for an interview in the immediate aftermath of her traumatic loss. I did the interview and then rushed to the bathroom because I was afraid I was going to burst into tears and I did not want to be seen as weak. I took a few deep breaths, returned to my desk, and got to work reviewing the interview and writing the story. As I was putting the story together, the assignment editor came over to my desk and informed me that someone from the sports department had also just interviewed the widow, so they would be using their story and mine was no longer needed. That poor widow had been subjected to 2 interviews from the same paper in the immediate aftermath of her traumatic loss. I had been tasked with interviewing her for nothing. What the fuck, I later wrote in my journal. Talking to a grieving family is hard. I was 20 years old. After graduating, I began my time at the Toronto Star, where many students and recent grads start in the radio room. Around the clock, I listened to scanners, talked to first responders, monitored other media, and slammed out breaking news stories for the web and for the paper. I loved the rush of crime reporting, and I seemed to have a knack for it. My bosses renewed my contract again and again, 4 contracts in total. Following that 4th contract at the Star, I got a full-time gig at the Toronto Sun. I covered all sorts of traumatic stories as a crime reporter there, homicides, traffic fatalities, child abuse, but I carved out a special interest in the domestic sex trafficking of women and girls. At the time, human trafficking was not yet a hot-button issue. Most politicians did not want to talk to me about it. There wasn't the funding that exists today. But over the span of about 3 years, I wrote countless stories about horrific cases of human trafficking and interviewed many, many survivors. I did not consider the harm that I could inflict on these survivors by interviewing them through a reporter's lens rather than a trauma-informed lens. Nor did I consider the impact that diving so deeply into this issue could have on me. Nightmares were a regular occurrence. I began putting some of these nightmares to paper in the form of a novel. It was a project I walked away from several times over the next decade, wishing I could delete its contents from my brain before finally publishing a couple years ago. I realize now that this project likely had just as much to do with processing my own feelings around this horrible crime and the survivor stories that I had heard as trying to make the public understand it. From the Toronto Sun, after years of swearing I would never be caught dead in front of a camera, I went to CTV News Toronto, where I would spend the bulk of my career.
We want to introduce you now to our newest member, Tamara. She is CTV's crime specialist in the field.
I have no idea how many hundreds of trauma survivors I interviewed in nearly a decade on television, but many of the stories are etched into my brain. I often cannot remember what I had for lunch, but I can recall intersections where people died more than a decade ago, the names of homicide victims and their smiling faces on the photos given to us by police and their family members. I remember in great detail the surveillance videos I've seen that show people running for their lives, including one showing a little boy who looked to be about 3 years old and who had been playing with a basketball in the hallway of a community center when someone was shot to death just outside the front doors, and everyone inside the community center began running, including that little boy. As a reporter, I saw so many videos of people being executed, the videos that members of the public don't see. I could cite lines from memory of highly emotional interviews with the grieving, the fearful, the desperate, the angry. They're all there inside my mind. And yet I loved my job. I loved writing stories that made people care. I loved the scanner chatter, the breaking news and ever-present deadlines, the go, go, go that all came to a stop, stop, stop when someone who is experiencing the worst hours of their life agreed to share their nightmare with me. I did not realize then the harm I might have been causing. In fact, a senior Toronto police officer once told me that he would tell people to talk to me because I cared about victims. And I really did. I held back tears during interviews. I cried for them on my drives home, then packed it all up and did it again the next day. I wanted to do good in this world. My job, I thought, was allowing me to do that. A little more than 2 years ago, I left journalism to launch Pickup Communications, a public relations firm that supports trauma survivors and the stakeholders who surround them. And I still have a foot in the journalism door as a fill-in radio host in Toronto and across the iHeartRadio Talk network. Almost exactly 2 years ago, I launched a research project aimed at exploring the impact of the media on trauma survivors and the impact of trauma on members of the media. I wanted to create something driven by the voices of survivors that would help journalists, investigators, and victim services personnel understand how they might support survivors who are forced to suffer on the public stage. After nearly 15 years of crime reporting, I never could have imagined how much I would learn and how much of an impact this project would have on me personally. To start, I created a number of surveys for trauma survivors whose stories were likely to have been covered in the media, including survivors of homicide and traffic fatalities, mass violence survivors, sexual assault and human trafficking survivors, and finally, I created a survey for journalists who cover trauma. I'd first like to discuss some findings from the surveys of homicide and traffic fatality survivors, as these are the survivors I encountered most often as a journalist. But first, a quick word about wording. When it comes to homicides and traffic fatalities, I recognize that those who are left behind are victims too, and refer to them as survivors, not to minimize their suffering, but because that is how many of them, particularly in my research project, self-identify. With the exception of one respondent from New Zealand, each of the 71 participants were from Canada and the United States. The blue markers you see are from homicide survivors. The orange markers are traffic fatality survivors. There were 45 survivors from Canada, 25 from the United States. There were 59 separate homicide cases and 15 traffic fatalities among the survivors. Most of these survivors had no media experience prior to their loved one or loved ones being killed. Despite this, most of the survivors were contacted by members of the media within the first 72 hours of their traumatic loss. Of those who described their first experience with the media, 50 described a negative experience, while only 15 described it as positive. Among those with a negative experience was the widow of a Toronto police officer who had media outside her home within hours of watching her husband die on live television. asked how she felt being contacted by members of the media in the immediate aftermath of her husband's homicide, she responded, exposed, ambushed, intimidated, privacy invaded, overwhelmed, pressured, attacked. Her sentiments reminded me of so many other trauma survivors in my research, including Jan.
My name is Jan Canty, and I'm a psychologist and
Tamara,
Jan's husband, yes?
were you sharing a story? We can't see the slides.
You can't see the slides?
No,
You can't see anything?
no. We can see you.
Sir, you can't see any slides? I'm sharing my screen. Let me try to share again.
Okay.
You haven't seen any of my slides?
No. Now we can see it.
We can see.
Okay, I'm going to pick it up from where I am right now. There have been a lot of slides. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you to Jan. Can you see now?
Yes, there we go.
Okay, I apologize, everybody. I don't know what happened. I didn't realize that none of my slides were coming up. So this is Jan.
My name is Jan Canty. I'm a psychologist, and I'm a homicide survivor.
Jan's husband, Alan, was the victim of a high-profile murder in Detroit in the 1980s. She recalled of the media.
They showed up at my house. They showed up at my office. They followed me. They were at the funeral. They were at the medical examiner building. Everywhere I turned, I felt like I was confronted by them. And most of them were pretty rude and assertive. And I felt like I was on display. It was more harmful than helpful.
More harmful than helpful. So many parts of my research pointed to this, particularly when survivors were confronted by media attention in the immediate aftermath of their traumatic loss. Perhaps not surprisingly, my research found that survivors were more likely to have had a positive experience with the media if several months or years had passed since their traumatic loss. Now let's take a look at some of the negative outcomes. Responses came from open-ended questions like, what do you recall from your first experience with the media? And if members of the media tried to contact you in the immediate aftermath, how did this make you feel? What emerged were 40 different categories of negative outcomes, some of which somewhat overlap. Here are the top 6 negatives. Of the 71 participants, more than half said that their interactions with the media and or the media coverage of their case contributed to their trauma. Now let's think about that for a second, because as a crime reporter, I had a personal code to not make the most horrible day of someone's life any more horrible, and to hopefully make it a bit better. But over and over again, survey respondents described behavior that I myself had done as a journalist, simply as part of the facts gathering and storytelling process, showing the car wreck, showing body bags, waiting outside the survivor's door, hoping they'd change their mind and come outside and say something to include in our story.
My name is Vesna Sikovic. I am Bosnian Canadian, and I had a son, only one son, and his name was Boris.
It was the beginning of October 2008, and I was working at the Toronto Sun. Hours after Vesna got a call from one of Boris's friends saying he had been shot, hours after she identified her only child's body in hospital, a homicide investigator passed me her address, presumably thinking an interview with her might spur some tips. But Vesna's life had just been turned upside down.
Everything stopped. That was just nothing. That was just, black hole.
Mm-hmm. And there I was interviewing her as she was shaking and answering phone call after phone call, hosting an apartment full of Boris's teenage friends. Vesna did not recall me being in her apartment all those years ago when she filled out one of my surveys. But she wrote that her first recollection of the media after Boris died was a complete disrespect of our shock, sorrow, and privacy. 25 of the 71 survivors cited misinformation that was reported in the media in relation to their loved one's case. Sometimes this was a result of a journalist interviewing someone who was an estranged relative of the victim or a childhood friend. One homicide survivor told me that one media outlet reported that her uncle had been shot in the head. The other said he had been shot in the back. Misinformation can make survivors feel like their stories don't matter, that they are not important enough to get the facts right. 19 survivors pointed to inappropriate details or images being reported in the media. For example, one woman's loved one was described as having been found in a pool of their own blood. Another survivor, whose husband was murdered in the 9/11 terror attacks, described being subjected to repeated images of the second plane hitting the South Tower of the World Trade Center, where her husband had been working. 14 survivors expressed privacy concerns. As a journalist, I knew it was a crappy thing that we were doing, bothering the bereaved who wanted to be left alone. This is why I created my company to support trauma survivors, because I saw it as a necessary evil. I couldn't comprehend at the time that some people are just very private people. And in times of grief, even if their loved one's killer is at large, even if they are angry or confused or desperate to not have this happen to another family, they just want to be left alone. 12 were disheartened about lack of follow-up from the media. I'll dig into this one a bit later. And 11 described being accosted, harassed, stalked, attacked, badgered, followed, or hunted by the media. There were a lot of emotions linked to negative outcomes. 20 of the 71 participants described feeling angry or furious with their interactions with the media or the media coverage of their case. Understandable when you consider things like misinformation being reported or journalists refusing to take no for an answer, knocking on their door over and over again. Many survivors were angry that journalists would think that they would even be ready to talk immediately after their loved one was killed. Sometimes these feelings of anger did not come until later, when the cloud of shock had lifted and they realized how they were taken advantage of, perhaps interviewed even though they didn't want to talk, even after they'd said no, but the reporter persisted. 16 felt hurt, sad, or demoralized. Again, this can happen when journalists do not respect a survivor's wishes. Why am I not worthy of being left alone? Why am I navigating this all alone? Why can't I just be left with my grief to plan my child's funeral, to come to terms with what happened? 8 felt vulnerable. This is not surprising, given that many survivors described not having a support person with them to navigate the media. And most of the survivors had no experience with the media prior to their traumatic loss. 8 felt afraid or fearful, including a woman whose elderly father was killed in his home outside Boston, Massachusetts, and who said, "Having the media camp out and follow us from my dad's house, police station, and funeral home was terrifying, as we never knew who it was, police, killer, or media." Almost 10% of the respondents reported that the media had a direct, negative, long-term impact on them personally. For example, the wife of that slain Toronto police officer wrote, "My experience with the media has had a negative and lasting effect on me. I am shy and private, and the exposure and invasion of my privacy, my family, my children, my husband's death added to the trauma and has changed me forever." Jan told me that the media coverage of her husband's murder made her feel self-critical. Here she was, a PhD educated psychologist, catching glimpses of herself in the media and feeling stupid and frightened, doubting herself.
It stuck with me for a long, long time, to the point where I did not speak of it for 30 years. And a lot of that was the media coverage. And it took a long, long time for me to, quote, come out of the closet. Mm-hmm. And when I did, I was ready, but it took a long time. And I keep wondering about how many other people never reached that point.
Though far fewer than the negatives, there were positive outcomes reported by survivors. The kindness or empathy of reporters, even among those with negative experiences, I found some survivors who forged meaningful friendships and relationships with reporters. One woman who suffered under intense media scrutiny of her daughter's murder for several years told me that she has received flowers and lovely, caring letters from different reporters. The opportunity to share their loved one's story. One man said that while he didn't want to be in front of the camera, every news story represented another day his murdered child's voice stayed alive. Another bereaved parent told me that she really did not want to do a one-on-one interview, but she felt that she had to for her daughter, and she was grateful to the media for keeping her daughter's story alive. The feeling of pursuing justice and affecting change. Another bereaved parent waited decades to engage with the media, but when she finally did, she was grateful to use her voice to keep her daughter's killer behind bars. The outpouring of community support that followed the media coverage. The ability to help other survivors by sharing their story, by showing them they're not alone. and using the media as an avenue for advocacy, such as advocating for victims' rights or against impaired driving. One of the questions I asked was what advice the survivors would give members of the media who cover traumatic events. More than a third of the respondents implored the media to be more sensitive, empathetic, gentle, sympathetic, compassionate, caring, kind, or to have a heart. Put yourself in the survivor's shoes, 13 of them said. Be respectful. But respectful or kind or compassionate as we might be, one of my biggest takeaways from my research has been that when you are working with trauma survivors, good intentions are not good enough. Many of the negative impacts homicide and traffic fatality survivors in my research experience could have been mitigated had the journalist worked with a liaison, a go-between to arrange interviews or release statements, ideally someone who is trauma-informed and familiar with how the media operates. And believe me when I say this, I am not trying to advertise my own services working with trauma survivors. I don't want there to be a need for liaisons hired from outside organizations. I want to compel organizations to build this into their survivor support systems. As a journalist, there was rarely a barrier between me and the survivors. No number to call to see if a family was talking. Nobody to act as that go-between. Sometimes if I knew the homicide investigator well, I might ask him or her to broach the subject with the survivors, but that was only sometimes. Negative impacts reported in my research also might have been mitigated had the journalist had a conversation about what the survivor could expect from the media coverage, including potentially upsetting images or details, who else the journalist was planning on interviewing, and the fact that even though the interview might last for half an hour, only a very small portion would end up in the story. I have heard this sentiment from so many survivors that they didn't realize that only a small part of the interview would be used, that other information would be reported. Survivors should not be surprised by what they see in a story about their trauma. Or had the journalist ensured the survivor had a support person or ally with them during the interview, someone who could advocate on their behalf, who had their best interests in mind, someone who could take notes, ask the journalist when the story would run, what could be expected, how the journalist could be contacted, whether the survivor could change their mind. Had the journalist continually asked for consent to ensure the survivor remained comfortable with where the conversation was going and how it would be used? Had someone made sure that the survivor understood that by talking to a reporter, other reporters may start calling, their interview may appear across multiple affiliates, their interview and or images may be used in the weeks, months, even years to come. They may be exposed to cruel social media commentary. The reporter may still include interviews with neighbors, witnesses, and or acquaintances. And perhaps the most important point, that the survivor was under no obligation to talk to a reporter. Bottom line, survivors need to understand what they are signing up for. Perhaps some harm may have been mitigated had the journalist followed up after the interview to make sure the survivor was okay. As a journalist, it never occurred to me to follow up. I thought I would be bothering the survivor or reminding them of a horrible time. I thought they would have other people checking in on them.
My name is Shauna Brown. I am a mother of 3, and I lost my son, Damal Graham, to gun violence on July 23rd of 2017.
People like Shauna Brown made me realize how wrong I had been in not following up with survivors over so many years of reporting.
You're asking somebody to potentially reveal such raw emotion and then just to, okay, thanks, and wrap up the camera and off you go, and that person is sitting there left with that. So I think that that's also a responsibility too, that if you're going to open up a can of worms in terms of feelings, that you also better be able to be prepared to help close that lid again too.
I left so many lids open as a crime reporter. And I didn't recognize the importance of being mindful of the impact of bringing a case back into the news unexpectedly, when perhaps that trauma lid had been closed. Journalists, myself among them, do this so often with so many routine crime stories, like, this is the 3rd daylight shooting in less than a month. Here are the others. Or, this is the 2nd person to die at this intersection. Here's the other one. And suddenly a handful of survivors who were not expecting media coverage of their case were seeing upsetting images of their loved one's body under a blanket or their vehicle wrapped around a pole. Jan Canty describes the feeling of the trauma dust just beginning to settle
and whoosh, along comes this huge breeze and up it goes again. And you're back into survival mode, and back to not being able to sleep, back to intrusive questions from neighbors, back to looking over your shoulder, back to indigestion and teeth grinding and headaches and the whole gamut that comes with it.
And it doesn't even need to be unexpected coverage of their case.
My name is Arlene Stuckless, and I'm the niece of John Wheeler, who was murdered on August 12, 2020.
And like so many survivors in my research, Arlene described having her trauma triggered anytime she sees something violent covered in the news.
Whether it's just police heard gunshots go off, or, another person was murdered, or somebody got shot, it takes you right back. It takes you right back to that initial moment when you heard your loved one was murdered.
Trauma triggers from the media was a common theme from the 10 mass violence survivors who I surveyed or interviewed. Many of them had been present for incidents that quickly became internationally recognizable simply by their place or date. With the exception of one survivor, none of the survivors was physically injured in their incident of mass violence, something I came to realize was very important because quite often when it comes to survivors of mass violence, journalists are treating very traumatized people as mere witnesses to an event rather than survivors of it. These are quite often people who thought they were going to die and or saw other people being murdered. And they're being confronted by cameras and microphones, asked to recount what they saw and heard. As a result, mass violence survivors are often further traumatized by the media, whether in the immediate aftermath of their traumatic event as they're confronted by reporters while perhaps trying to find their loved ones, or in the days, weeks, months, even years down the road, as they watch coverage of their traumatic event on the news, are asked for more and more interviews, or see stories about similar acts of violence. In her survey, one mass shooting survivor described the moment she was being escorted to safety from her high school, where she had just witnessed her friend being murdered. My first encounter with the media was very traumatic. I was being escorted out of the school campus to the parent meeting location. I recall seeing a man holding a camera and pointing it at us. I recall being terrified because I just had a gun pointed at me during the shooting, and this camera looked like he was pointing a gun at us, taking pictures. I felt violated and afraid. My research into mass violence survivors also opened my eyes to something that is relevant when considering any trauma survivor being interviewed by the media, and that is trauma brain. As I'm sure many of you know, trauma affects different people's brains differently. Sometimes it affects their ability to remember things accurately. And this is very important when we consider the fact that journalists will often interview trauma survivors as a way of telling the public what happened. If the information they are conveying is inaccurate because of the way trauma impacted that survivor's brain, that is a problem. For example, one mass violence survivor told me that in the days after her school shooting, she told a reporter she saw a tank outside her school, but there was no tank. Because mass violence survivors in my research were likely to have had their trauma triggered by coverage of other violent acts or sounds similar to these acts, the same survivors were likely to have changed the way they consume the news. Some of them stopped watching, reading, or listening to the news altogether. When you consider the growing number of people, in particular in the United States, who have been present for an incident of mass violence, that is a lot of people, potentially into the hundreds of thousands, who are being impacted negatively on an ongoing basis by the news media. And not only are journalists triggering the trauma of survivors by the images they show and the descriptions that they use, the very conversations journalists have with survivors can have long-term impacts on their health.
I'm Louise Godbold. I'm the executive director of ECHO, which is a non-profit that provides training for parents, trauma survivors, and those who support trauma survivors, whether they be professionals or family members.
So Louise Godbold knows a thing or two about trauma, but there's more.
If you Google me, you will find that I'm a Weinstein survivor. I'm one of the first women who came forward in October 2017.
So Louise knows a thing or two about trauma, and she knows a thing or two about sharing her story in the media over and over again. She has been interviewed dozens of times, often in relation to her own victimization. Louise spoke with me about the impact of telling one's traumatic story, about the impact that it has on the body, how it activates the part of the nervous system that responds to stress, how it sends cortisol levels up, how those toxic, heightened cortisol levels coursing through the body can lead to long-term physical problems, how over time those cortisol receptors can get blown out to the point that a trauma survivor will not have the ability to turn off stress.
So every time you're making me go over my story, you're contributing to me being less able to handle stress and being more likely to be stuck on that stress response. We call it stuck on high, which is the hypervigilant, the anxiety, the panic, the rage, all of those things.
And there's the psychological impact too, one that I heard from other survivors of sexual violence and human trafficking as well, where the media gives them a label, a victim or survivor label, and they become known for that really awful moment in time. Louise, for example, was abused by the Hollywood mogul twice. And in both cases, she told me, the abuse lasted a matter of minutes.
I swear that my grandchildren, when they Google me, they're still going to find that story coming up first. We are so much more than the trauma that happened to us.
They are sisters and mothers and nonprofit leaders and church volunteers and local champions for squash growing.
And we have so many other aspects that really reflect better who we are and what our lives have been on this earth and who we matter to and why we matter.
I'd now like to tell you about another part of my research, and that is victims, survivors, and the impact on the media. As I mentioned earlier, in the course of my career, I interviewed countless trauma survivors. I found them through the phone book, social media, and by knocking on their doors. I approached them at crime scenes, in courtrooms, outside funeral homes, and most regrettably, in the waiting rooms of intensive care units at hospitals. I did it all without any training for covering traumatic events, no trauma-informed interview techniques, nothing about self-care, none of it in journalism school, none of it on the job, and my research showed me that I was far from alone. Of the 22 journalists who filled out my survey from across Canada and the United States, journalists from various market sizes, journalists with various levels of experience, none of them had received any meaningful trauma training before becoming a professional journalist. Only 3 of them received any meaningful training in trauma since becoming a journalist. This, despite the fact that all of them report on traumatic events at least once a year, 19 of them at least once a month, 17 of them at least once a week, 14 of them at least a couple times a week, 7 of them at least once a day, and 2 of them more than once per day. Most weeks throughout my career, I would have fallen into the once a day or more than once a day categories. Now, you may have some pretty strong opinions about journalists who show up at someone's door just hours after their loved one was killed. I've probably heard some of your sentiments: vultures, ambulance chasers. But consider this. Even though most of the journalists in my research said that they reach out to survivors within the first 24 hours of a traumatic event or as soon as they have the information to do so, only 5 said that they were comfortable reaching out to survivors in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, essentially saying that it was what it was, part of the job. None of them expressed any pleasure in it. Most journalists expressed some degree of discomfort. Asked to describe their level of comfort in reaching out to survivors in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, this journalist response represents a very common sentiment. It is the worst part of the job and the thing I like least about my profession. I'd now like to tell you a story about when I was a young journalist. I was slamming together a story on Toronto's latest homicide while working a late shift. The murder happened in an apartment, and because I could not go to the scene, I was furiously calling through every listed phone number in the building, doing what I was trained to do, gathering as much information as possible. The victim had been stabbed to death by her son. Her husband witnessed the murder. I reached someone in the building who offered up the information that I would likely find the husband at the local pool hall, that he and his wife had been heavy drinkers. It was at this point that I should have thought, well, this homicide only happened a few hours ago. There's no way I'm calling that pool hall. But as I said, I was doing my job, gathering as much information as possible. I remember dialing the pool hall and hoping that nobody would answer, or that the husband would not be there, or that he would refuse to talk. But the bartender answered the phone, and the husband was there, and the bartender handed him the phone. This man, this grieving husband who just hours earlier witnessed his wife being murdered by their son, was on the phone with me, a reporter. His words were slurred, and he seemed oblivious to the objections coming from his friend every 30 seconds, his friend who would grab the phone and remind me of what a horrible human being I was for trying to talk to a man in such a state. The story I wrote for the next day's paper did not mention the slurring words or objecting friend. My supervisors were pleased with the scoop. It ran on A2. I saved the clipping for future job applications. I also wrote about it later in my journal. I don't remember the last time I felt like such shit. I was 21 years old. That grieving husband did not fill out one of my surveys, but I bet if he had, he'd have reported a negative experience with the media and perhaps written that the media coverage of his wife's murder, upon seeing the story in the next day's paper, exacerbated his trauma, that he felt exploited, preyed upon, hunted, harassed, attacked. From what I can tell, the paper never covered the case again, but the story has stuck with me for more than 15 years, not because I was proud, I wasn't, or because of the very real empathy I felt for the man, but because I have not been able to shake the feeling that that interview, quite simply, never should have happened, and because of the moral injury I suffered because of it. Oh, how I've come to realize all the moral injury I've suffered over all those years. Most of the journalists in my research said reporting on trauma has impacted them negatively. One journalist, reflecting on her time regularly writing about and researching intimate partner violence, wrote, "In retrospect, I realized that each story took a piece of me that I never did get back. I took the stories home, ruminated. I looked at men differently. My focus was on hope and education for readers, solutions, but I think the personal toll was cumulative and under the surface for a long time." And another, "I have suffered from vicarious trauma and repetitive stress, and it became very difficult to continue in my job without addressing that." Said another, "Honestly do not want to contemplate this." And another, "I've thankfully never suffered from PTSD as a result of my work, but I definitely have felt pretty close to burnout as a result of covering emotionally sensitive and draining events. The combination of long hours, stress of navigating a breaking news situation, and trying not to cause additional harm while doing your job, it's heavy and it takes a lot out of me." Now let's pause here for a second and consider this quote. I wonder how many of you in various professions who at times have felt pretty close to burnout, who work with trauma survivors and are trying to not cause additional harm, can relate. And finally, from a long time, now retired crime reporter, someone I worked alongside for many years, I don't want to be a crime reporter ever again. This was someone who was a legend in the halls of police headquarters, who had the cell phone or pager numbers of every homicide investigator, who seemed to love the job, much like I did. His words hit me like a bag of bricks, but as I reflected on them and my research and my own feelings, I realized something. Me neither. I don't want to be a crime reporter ever again. I can't. For one, the system is not adequately set up to support survivors with the media, and I don't want to be a part of the problem. But also, I have had too much trauma exposure that I'm now dealing with because I failed to deal with it at the time. I didn't realize that each of those interviews in those darkest hours of someone else's life left its mark. The dead kids, the traumatized kids, the autopsy photos, the bereaved parents and siblings and friends, the surveillance footage, the cell phone videos, the graphic court exhibits, and emotional victim impact statements. It took me a lot of therapy and a lot of research to reconcile the fact that I could indeed suffer from this job, and that my suffering did not take away from the very different suffering of the people I reported on. One study examining potential hazards for people who work with trauma found that many journalists who cover traumatic events become first responders, and that their trauma exposure may be complicated further by conducting interviews with victims, witnessing the aftermath of horrific events, and the limited time they have to process emotional reactions between the interviews and writing their news stories. I reported on crime for 15 years. I don't remember ever having a conversation with a manager or a journalism instructor about the importance of self-care. and that is a problem. I often had young journalists ask me over the years, how do you deal with all the trauma? What are your coping mechanisms? I had my go-to lines. First and foremost, I would say, you have to feel it. You can't completely detach because the emotion should come through in your writing. And then there's the dark humor, crying into my steering wheel on my drives home, talking to my sister, hugging my partner. And I thought all those things were working until they weren't. Looking back on my journal entries from early in my career, when I really started reporting on trauma on a regular basis, I see that the warning signs were there. Sometimes I wonder how we can ever be happy, I wrote. Sometimes I wonder if I can really hack it in this journalism world. So much pain. How different would I be had I not chosen journalism? Not long after this entry in 2008, I never wrote in my journal again, and I forgot about these comments until I dug them up during my research project. Throughout the years, I thought I was coping well because I hadn't turned to alcohol or drugs like some of my colleagues. I didn't recognize that the invasive thoughts and the nightmares, along with other symptoms, were signs of post-traumatic stress. A little more than a year ago, I received an email from a former Toronto bureaucrat who I'd never met. He'd just heard about my company, Pickup Communications. I often watch your 6 p.m. reporting on CTV News on crime and other awful events, he wrote. The pain I could see in your eyes over time told me you needed to do something different. I honestly felt for you. How was it that a complete stranger could see this from watching me through his television screen, but I could not? About a year and a half ago, after reaching a particularly low point, I had the good fortune of finding a therapist who understands vicarious trauma. She asked me last year, what difference do you think it would have made for you if you had had bi-weekly therapy sessions throughout your career, built into your schedule, a day every 2 weeks dedicated to talking it out? A big one, I said. I think I'd be a better mom, a better partner. I probably wouldn't have so many nightmares and acutely invasive thoughts about bad things happening to the people I love. I'm happy to say that more than a year later, into some pretty intensive therapy, I'm doing a lot better than I was a couple years ago. But I do get frustrated knowing that much of what I suffer today and much of what so many others have suffered because of my work could have been avoided had I been conscious of the damage I was causing over all those years when I thought that my very good intentions, my compassion for victims and survivors, coupled with my love of the job, were enough. What I didn't realize until this research project was that practicing trauma-informed journalism and really any sort of trauma-informed care is not only necessary to protect trauma survivors, it is necessary to protect ourselves. In all my years of crime reporting, I never once recalled hearing this term, trauma-informed journalism. When I left journalism and launched Pickup Communications, I thought I knew everything there was to know about trauma. I interacted with trauma survivors and people who work with trauma on a daily basis. How much more trauma-informed could I be?
I'm Angela McQueen. I am a high school teacher in Illinois, and in September 2017, I subdued and disarmed a school shooter in our cafeteria.
My research project showed me how wrong I was, how little I knew. Angela, what does the term trauma-informed journalism mean to you?
For me, it's knowing enough about trauma, or taking enough time to learn about trauma, and that to learn that it affects people differently.
But I realize now that when I was a journalist, I did not know enough about trauma.
It means that the journalists are aware of the trauma, potential triggers, and the impacts that it has on the victims and survivors.
I was not aware of how my work could trigger trauma. I did not understand the impact.
Giving the interviewee more control.
And also having some kind of follow-up.
But I mean, just to know, really seriously, not to call the parents when they're in a funeral home, right? Or stuff like that.
I didn't give control. I rarely followed up. I called parents at the funeral home and stuff like that.
Trauma-informed journalism. My first reaction was that's a wish. It's a hope. It's not realized.
It is caring about the survivor's experience.
But if you really are trying to make a difference, if you are trying to inform the public, then you need to be trauma-informed.
But even with my best intentions, even with my compassion for victims and survivors, I wasn't. I was not trauma informed, and I know I caused harm, just as anyone who works with trauma survivors without being trauma informed can. And that reckoning has been difficult. Amy C. O'Neill, a mental health professional who is also a survivor of the Boston Marathon bombing, told me that being a survivor of mass violence is a very strange and lonely trauma. And I found similar sentiments among other trauma survivors, many of whom have told me that they've only truly felt understood by other survivors. Unless we have lived that experience, we cannot truly understand, but we must make the effort to get as close to understanding as possible. And we must understand that when it comes to trauma, it's just different. We as journalists cannot apply the same rules to these stories as we do to other stories. We can't be flies on the wall, recording history, because this trauma makes us vulnerable. And the sharing of the trauma makes the people we are reporting on extremely vulnerable. For the same reasons, healthcare workers must treat traumatized people differently, with more care. Teachers must. Guidance counselors must, police officers must, shelter workers must, lawyers must, politicians must, everybody must. For those of us whose jobs require us to extract stories of trauma, we must give survivors agency. As a journalist, that would mean asking the survivor ahead of time what questions they are comfortable answering, letting them see my story before it airs or is printed, reminding them that they can take a break or just stop an interview altogether at any time, asking them what they would like to get out of the interview, where they want the interview to happen, who they want there to support them, and on and on. When talking about reporting on Indigenous communities, CBC journalist Duncan McHugh has said that we must not be story takers, we must be storytellers. And I think this applies to reporting on any traumatized person or community, to any job that involves extracting someone else's trauma. We can't just be taking their story, using their story. Not when the work we do can make the survivors we work with exhausted, confused, sad, anxious, afraid, or numb. When it can cause their heart rates to quicken. When it can have severe and long-lasting mental and physical impacts. As I alluded to earlier, when it comes to the media, and indeed many of the institutions that interact with trauma survivors, the system is not set up in a collaborative way, in a way that should support survivors and the stakeholders who surround them, rather than setting them up to fail. This must change, but I have found hope.
My name is Elin Green, and I'm currently manager of victim services and human trafficking at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
I spoke with Elin about all the ways journalists can be harmful with the images they show and the language they use, with the survivors that harass and the ones they ignore, with the phone calls and the door knocks at the homes of the recently bereaved.
They're also still hoping that it's not true. And this person standing in front of them just confirmed that it is absolutely true. So that's just another layer of trauma.
Mm-hmm. After the interview ended, I was telling Elin about the guilt I carry for all the ways I got things wrong for so many survivors over so many years, with the interviews at inappropriate times and in inappropriate places, with inappropriate questions, with the images I showed and the words I spoke. And this is what she said.
If we all look back to our careers, I think about families that I didn't serve the way I could have or would have or should have, because I've learned so much since then.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't know about trauma and the brain 20, 30 years ago. We just, this woman's very confused, or she's not being forthcoming, you know, that kind of thing. So it's not guilt, it's growth.
It's not guilt, it's growth. And this is the thought I would like to end on before opening up the floor to questions. And as we prepare to take some questions, I will put my contact information up on the screen, as well as my website. I have lots of resources on my website for survivors and journalists and those looking to support survivors with the media. And there will be more resources shaped by the voices of survivors in the weeks and months to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tamara. That was fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. We have
Oh, I can't hear you right now. Should I be? I just heard something. Are you there, Kim?
Hi. Did you hear the question?
No, I didn't hear the question. You cut out there. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry about that. This question had come in early in the session, but I believe it's worth repeating. Did you ever feel you had to turn off your own emotions in order to interview someone who had just lost someone or someone who had suffered a trauma?
I don't think that I ever did it consciously. And if I ever tried, I think that it was very difficult because I certainly remember many interviews where I was very emotional and just trying not to cry because it wasn't my trauma, it was somebody else's trauma. But many times as a reporter, especially when I got into television and I had so many deadlines throughout the day, while I was doing these highly emotional interviews, I was also concentrating on the fact that I had to file a story in an hour, or, okay, they just mentioned this picture, let's make sure we get a shot of this picture after, or get a shot of this, or do this, and then we got to run to the truck. So I was always thinking about the next steps while I was also present in the interview. So I think that also is something it's problematic for both the survivor and the journalist, I would say, because you can't be fully present with all the demands of the journalism job, and as a journalist, there's not ever any time to process my feelings. Like my therapist had told me during one session that after some of the heavy stuff that I share with her sometimes, she will go after the session and meditate for 5 minutes and just think through all of the things that she has heard. And I wish that I would have had time or taken time to do that as a journalist. I didn't. But no, there was never a conscious effort to turn it off. As I said, I always felt that you had to feel it so that I could convey that emotion to the public. But it's problematic on a few different levels.
Right. Okay. Here's another question. As a female journalist, would you say that the journalistic field is still male dominated? And have you ever noticed any correlation between the gender of the journalist and the level of their compassion or respect towards survivors?
No. So for that last question, no, I have not. I can say that I worked with a lot of excellent journalists in Toronto, the vast majority of whom were very compassionate people. And I am thinking about men and women. On the crime reporting beat, it was historically dominated by men, and all the men that I worked alongside were incredibly compassionate, had real hearts for victims and survivors. In terms of, is it still mostly dominated by men? I don't know if the industry is. I think that like many professional industries, women end up leaving journalism because the demands of the job are not conducive to the work-life balance that many women are after. That's why I left journalism to begin with, because I wanted to be home for dinner. And as a journalist who was reporting on the 6 o'clock news and all areas of the greater Toronto area every day, I couldn't be. So in that sense, I would say yes, but I think that there's really an effort now to diversify newsrooms, whether by sexual orientation, gender, race, or, what have you.
Okay, we have a couple more, so we'll just go through those. Have you ever faced people with survivor syndrome who felt guilty for surviving while others did not? What can we do to help them deal with the feelings of guilt aside from dealing?
Kim, you just cut out there for the last part of the question, but I can start by addressing the first part, certainly. And I can really only speak to, yes, I've met a lot of survivors, trauma survivors, who have had survivor guilt after the fact. And sometimes these are witnesses, sometimes these are family members who weren't there, what have you. And I've also, I think, because we don't really talk about it a lot in journalism, met journalists who have that too. I know that I've certainly had that survivor guilt, all these, especially when I started coming to terms with my own trauma, feelings around trauma, because this is something I really had to work through. Like, this is not my trauma. This is somebody else's trauma. I should not be suffering. I don't have the right to suffer when it comes to this because I wasn't even there. Many times I would be driving home from some impoverished community in Toronto and, watching these kids in my rearview mirror And here I am driving home to my complete family, to my safe neighborhood, to my house that, that has 3 bedrooms, to my backyard, like I had that guilt. And I think the most important way for people who work with survivors to sort of get past that, although I don't know if I'm quite there yet, is to work through it and to recognize that everybody suffers. One of the things that my therapist said to me is, like you, like me, we suffer. So my suffering, as I said in my presentation, does not take away from the very different suffering of somebody else. I think for the longest time, I felt like I couldn't feel these feelings because that would be minimizing what somebody else was feeling who actually suffered the loss. And I think it's recognizing that there are different levels of trauma, whether it's survivor's guilt or, vicarious trauma or what have you, or primary trauma, secondary trauma. And just, first point is just recognizing that it's there and that it's valid, and then being able to move forward from there.
Okay. And we'll just do one more question. Do you believe the public's appetite for the story behind the story has led to the chase and appetite for more and more information from crime journalists?
Absolutely. I think that just as when I was reporting on human trafficking, I would always say, there wouldn't be a supply without the demand. So something I really try to do when I talk to especially like general audiences is make them think about the content that they are reading or listening to. Maybe ask the newsrooms that they're following, what are your policies on covering trauma? What are your policies for, taking care of your reporters and taking care of the people that your reporters are reporting on? Because most newsrooms either don't have policies, or they have policies that are completely ignored, or people just are not aware of. Like 2 of the journalists in my research project worked in the same newsroom. One of them told me that their newsroom had a policy for covering traumatic events. The other one said that they did not have a policy. So it goes to show how the system is failing in that sense. But I will say that true crime is one of the most sought after genres. It's one of the most popular genres. So much so that I'm in the process right now of, I've basically finished writing it. It won't be published until next year, but writing a book based on my research. And it is so not typical true crime, but my marketing people at the publishing house would love to be able to market it as true crime because they know how popular that is. And part of me is like, I'd be happy for it to appear next to true crime, because maybe somebody who would usually read true crime that is perhaps, hurtful instead of helpful for the victims and survivors who are the subjects of it, might also pick up my book and realize the other side of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great place to stop for this afternoon. So thank you so much, Tamara. Your presentation was fantastic. And very informative. And I know there were lots of really great comments. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending Tamara's session today. We now have a 15-minute break, and the stream sessions will start at 2:15. You're welcome to return to the lobby or check out the exhibit booth, and we'll see you in the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tamara? Oh.
Yes.
Do you want to share your slides? I'm not sure what happened.
I don't know what happened either. I don't know if I had turned off like sharing or something, but I clicked stop sharing and start again when it started. So do you want me to like redo that part to put into the record?
Yeah, sure. Let's share. If
Do you want me to? I don't remember how many minutes had gone by, but I could re-record all the way up to like Jan Canty's, like where I picked up, like finish that slide, and then just to make it an easy edit.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know what happened. Like I couldn't see. I'm seeing now in the chat that there were messages that you weren't seeing the slides, but I didn't have the chat coming up because I was full screen on the presentation.
That's okay.
Just let me. Yeah, some of that stuff would have looked pretty weird because I had sound that I was pausing for.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
when I realized, okay, she thinks she's sharing, but she's not. So,
Yes, I'm
okay.
happy that you stopped me. Okay, I'm just about to share. Oh, where's my mouse?
Okay.
I gotta close this.
So we can't, Tamara, maybe
Yep.
I can't do it right now because I have to go into another session, but maybe we can make time this week.
What do you think? I mean, my week is pretty jammed. I don't know if I'll be able to. There's not like another room I can go into to record or something like that. Or I could just record. I could.
Can you
Michael, are you present?
record with yourself?
I could record with myself. My only worry is that I don't know if my, like the visual of me would come up in a different area or something. I can try that certainly.
Yeah.
And send you guys a link and just see if it works.
Okay. Okay.
You want to do that?
Let's try that. Yeah. And if not,
Okay.
you were still engaging, just speaking, because I was like, okay, maybe she's just doing an intro.
No. Oh my God. Okay, I'll do that right now, and then I'll, it'll take a while for it to convert and everything like that, but once I have a link for you guys, I'll send it over.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thank you,
All
and
right.
good luck with the rest of the conference.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye-bye.